On today's episode of eCommentary, we are joined by Nordgreen CMO Christopher Day. We're going to cover all things attribution, marketing mix modeling, how his grounding and education at the Hut Group, leading My Protein in North America, has shaped him into the CMO that he has become. It's an amazing episode with a lot of golden nuggets, so sit back, relax, and pull out a notepad. This one's going to be interesting. On today's episode of eCommentary, we are joined by a fellow Brit over in Denmark, Christopher Day from Nordgreen. Nordgreen is a Danish watch brand that have been growing at a pretty remarkable rate internationally. They have a really, really smart group of guys behind the brand and also some wicked creative. Christopher's background is from some of the major e-commerce players. So I'm really looking forward to picking your brains, learning as much as possible in our conversation. Christopher, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Very welcome. Thanks for having me.
I think that when I looked at your sort of CV on LinkedIn and saw that you've worked at the Hut Group, Unilever, and now a super fast growing e-commerce. I mean, on the website, they class Nordgreen as a startup, but I'm not sure whether it's classed as a startup anymore due to how fast it's risen. How did you start off at the Hut Group? And I think I'm super interested, like how has that grounding from probably one of the biggest players in global e-commerce led you into the position that you're in right now?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So, I mean, I started up as just a marketing assistant, marketing executive to begin with. The Hut Group's very, I would say, ferocious. They're quite they're very optimistic as well about young talent. So it's very easy if you are opportunistic, or it was at least relatively easy if you're opportunistic and ambitious, to at least put your hand up and be given opportunities. Of course, there's another story as to whether you're going to be successful with them, but they give opportunities very young. So I quickly moved up the ladder at My Protein, starting as a marketing exec, then went to actually manage their Dutch website very briefly, having not spoken Dutch, which kind of puts into perspective what digital and performance marketing can be, really. You know, sometimes you don't even need to know the language because it's so technically driven by numbers. But then moved on to My Protein USA, which was very young. There were a couple of people before me that had left, and they were looking for a new candidate to lead the market. And I sort of quickly put my hand up and thought, I'll give it a go. Managed to sort of make quite a big success out of it. And I think really what's so great about the Hut Group is the way they set everything up from a performance perspective, how they visualize what e-commerce is. You know, they make a very clear framework. And by that, I mean, they sort of split the channels up. So paid performance, organic, email, into sort of designated specialist teams. Rather than making it too broad, which is obviously a luxury of a big company where you can hire, you can hire a specialist resource to that degree. But they do it in a very good way, in a way that allows people to sort of feed off of each other, share knowledge, and develop. And me, I was leading the market, so I basically am someone who didn't really know anything about any of those channels at the beginning. You know, you become sort of this coordination guy who's able to just feed off of these guys who are sort of the best in the business at what they do. And I think it just gives a really strong platform because they've nailed the operational side of things. So you know, you could have the best customer experience. You know, they've nailed the talent recruitment. They've they also were at a time, if you rewind sort of 8 years ago, 7 years ago when I was there, it was at a time when this performance marketing, you know, was going through quite a lot of change. But it was at sort of that peak mid sort of 2010s to 15s, where everyone was kind of discovering what performance marketing could do. And there was also a massive bull market too, so consumer sentiment was really strong. There was a huge move of consumer trends to go online. I mean, there still is, of course, in different ways, but this whole performance marketing approach was really starting to dig in. And even things like Facebook, when I first joined the Hut Group, Facebook wasn't a big advertising platform, and they hadn't hacked it. So there was just this transition, and everyone was kind of saying, "Oh, have you tried Facebook yet?" And which sounds ludicrous today, right? Whereas Facebook is, probably the second biggest platform that people spend their marketing dollar on. So I think what they did very well is they were the forefront of ecom, but they didn't make it so glamorous. They sort of just broke it down into pure performance marketing and allowed young people like myself to hop on a train where you could just sap knowledge from leading experts within their specific channels. And then I also think like they're able to share knowledge because they work across so many different verticals. So they work across health and beauty, they work across male grooming, DVDs, gaming, to nutrition. So that because there's so many verticals there, I think they just have an ability to share that knowledge. If you're a newbie in the game and you just want to know what the basics are, and you don't want something too glamorous, then that's an excellent place to start. Because I think a lot of brands are more brand focused, right? Because they have to look after their brand, and so they necessarily don't have so much of a focus on performance marketing. But the Hut Group, for a lot of their websites, they are sort of almost marketplaces. You look at like My Protein with 2,500 products, where that was at least the SKU count when I was there. Or you look at like Look Fantastic, the kind of marketplaces, and they negotiate big deals with huge brands to then go and resell their products. So they don't necessarily, they have to look after those brands. They're able to adopt almost like an Amazon model where it's like really competitive, which suits a performance marketing strategy really, really well.
That leads me on to I'm going to get an answer to a question that hope you're able to answer it. So nutrition is probably one of the most competitive categories at the moment with performance marketing, with the likes of the Hut Group, Huel, all of these brands playing in it. And there's a common saying within performance marketing about when brands are growing in nutrition, that you're looking to compete with players like My Protein, who are actively willing to lose money on the initial acquisition cost. Is that a myth or is that a reality?
I think it's a bit of a myth, to be honest. It wasn't, at least at My Protein. I think they are still, I think they're still looking for a profitable case for kind of from day one. But absolutely, they are willing to overinvest. But I wouldn't say lose money on. I think because I think it's easy to say that you would have, at least back in the day where attribution maybe was, I guess, potentially a little bit. It was also quite cloudy in some ways there, where attribution models themselves weren't particularly prevalent, right? I mean, we talk about a lack of data today, but in reality, if you go back sort of 6-7 years ago, it still wasn't that clear. Because there wasn't really, this attribution mentality was only really starting to come about when I was there. So trying to sort of map that across a different customer journey, I think it's easy to say, we're happy to lose money on the first purchase and then make money on the second and third. But a company like that, actually, I think you'd be surprised. I don't think that many companies at least sort of track that customer behavior. In a world of data, I think really you want every customer every purchase to be profitable, and splitting it up into those sort of customer buckets. It's quite difficult to do, especially if it's especially challenging if you're so performance driven again, and you're relying on things like say email marketing, and you're so instantaneous. If you're not building a brand there, My Protein, they're certainly building a brand, or they are building a brand, but they're very discount driven. So I think if you end up losing money on the first purchase, you're probably going to also lose money on the second and the third.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the challenge of like a large portion of my proteins customers, even though they spend a lot of effort on loyalty, are these, light buyers. They have a good idea, they buy a protein shake, a couple of boxes of protein, some bars, and then they never go to the gym.
Yeah, exactly. And you don't also really know. It's very difficult to know where your customer has come from, from like the second and the third and the fourth, to track that every time. So who's to say whether that customer, came organically the first and then actually came through your paid channels the second and the third, so that actually means that you actually probably have a more profitable case in the first purchase. It's actually quite difficult to bucket them like that. So really what I think a lot of brands do is more look at a blended grass, which at least that's what we do. That's far more practical on a day-to-day. In reality, in a good case, in a brilliant case, you would be able to bucket customers like that, but it is quite challenging to do so.
Yeah, and I think you can drive yourself crazy with a lot of gaps in what you can actually track at the moment. And there's so many products on the market that are offering to a solution, but what they offer is their form of the solution without giving you probably the solution that you want. So there's always a compromise when it comes to attribution and customer journey tracking. And I think you've just got to make peace with the fact that, we might never properly know. We can try things with lift studies, but we've got to just be happy with our results. And if the results are coming, we keep investing in the channels.
And that's also, and even more so as a luxury of a big business versus a smaller one. If you don't have enough data, if you don't have enough brand awareness in a market, then those list studies are useless. I mean, we've run several of them on Facebook, for example, before, but even in the markets where we are, let's say, significant, and we have maybe a couple of million visits a year, those lift studies are still very difficult to really draw baseless conclusions on.
They're good if you can get some ad credits out of the reps for them, but but that's maybe sometimes the best use is the impressions that you get. So going on from the Hut Group, you move from one giant to probably an even bigger giant when you move to Unilever. Like, how was that transition? What was the difference between maybe the Hut Group's approach and Unilever's approach to marketing?
A world and a way different. I mean, Unilever, I think, is probably a really good example of building a brand or brands. I mean, they have hundreds and hundreds of brands, but my role at Unilever was to sit in kind of this newly created consulting function almost. I think at the time, the turnover was around 50 billion, and the e-commerce department was 2 billion, so it's less than 5% of their total turnover, but it was still the fastest growing segment of their business. They wanted to build this team, which at the time I was the second or the third person in this team, to basically then recruit these experts to go in. I use experts, I don't think you're ever really an expert, but they recruited these experienced guys to go in and deploy them into their newly acquired brands, particularly within the health and beauty division. That was at least our responsibility. And I mean, I think this is kind of where it shows the luxury of having just so much experience surrounding you. And I think what the Hut Group does and the way that they've built it in a way where there's just, it's so clear what the strategy is across the whole company. Whereas Unilever, they have a lot of little brands that don't really communicate with each other. And it's very different. And that's what our job was to do, basically pass those learnings across the different brands in order to build the experience and expertise within e-com. And for a lot of those brands, they're very young, so they didn't have the luxury of all of that experience yet. So it's kind of trying to bring that knowledge from the Hut Group. But I think for me, I mean, I was still very young, I was still only 25 at the time. And, so for me, it was a big learning curve because I was able to, and it has been in the few moves that I've done. You know, when you move from company to company, I'm a big advocate for changing company because I think it allows you to recontextualize the knowledge that you've built up into a new situation. So that bubble, if you want to call it, you know, of knowledge that you have, it totally shifts in perspective when you go and you go and sit in another company, because what you think worked before no longer is that case, right? So I was, I guess, quite cocky in my knowledge coming from the Hut Group, and then very quickly realizing, you know, trying to recontextualize it in a different industry, that actually doesn't necessarily work in the same way, because at the Hut Group, they're very discount focused, really performance. I don't want to say they don't care about brand, because their brand is what they build out of it, but it's not like they are holding onto the brand equity and trying to build longevity by not using discounts, for example, which is obviously quite a common practice, I guess, that some would consider, particularly if you sat in branding, to diminish your brand equity, right? So, but they have a very hardcore discount strategy. And so a lot of the perspective, let's say, for example, if you have a very performance driven, if you have a very discount strategy, you might lean a lot more towards, let's say, affiliate marketing, you know, because you're going to use vouchers and coupons. You maybe you don't lean as much on, let's say, I mean, I guess discounts kind of suit every channel almost, but you know, if you didn't use discounts, you know, you'd probably lean much more towards like a creative and content type approach. So it's just, the strategies just vary quite significantly. So moving from that company from the Hut Group to Unilever, where these guys were trying to build, you know, brand equity, not using a discount-led strategy, you know, you could totally recontextualize your knowledge. Which was a very steep learning curve for me.
But it's such, seeing where you are now as a CMO, it's almost like the ultimate two-step. You know, one, you learn performance marketing from one of the, you know, the leading players in performance marketing, and then you go to a company that is all about brand and building brand, and then from there it's like, okay, I've learned performance and I've learned brand, and now I'm coming into an e-commerce business where actually I think, you know, you can pull on both elements. So it's kind of a genius two-step. And for people who maybe have aspirations to one day be a CMO, you know, it's maybe not a bad route to follow if you can go in with that really heavy kind of performance-led activation, and then look at the brand, and you've got the long and short of it, literally.
In retrospect, it sounds very good, but obviously when you're in your mid-young 20s, I didn't necessarily think of it like that. I sort of just got a job at the Hut Group. It was amazing for me, and then had an amazing company opportunity at Unilever. But yes, I think in hindsight, I'm very pleased with the way it's.
And that's kind of leads us on to your position now at Nordgreen. There's a marketing scientist, Mark Ritson, who talks a lot about the different types of CMO that are out there. You've got the performance first CMO who's driving activation very heavily, and then you've got maybe more of a brand led CMO who takes a much larger kind of viewpoint. And what he says is sometimes if the CMO is too performance driven in a company that's not necessarily performance driven, he gets the business to a point with performance marketing, but then he can't take it beyond that point. And then on the flip side, you've got the brand led CMO who gets fired after, you know, 2 years because the strategy hasn't kicked in, and he gets fired or she gets fired too early. And what we have with you is probably someone who has the commercial understanding of both parts. And do you think that that's advantageous coming from e-commerce and trading and then going into a CMO role?
I'd say it's a really interesting question, and very prevalent for, it's very relevant for today's world, for sure, as we move into more turbulent times, or we've been through the turbulence, you know, with COVID and consumer sentiments being all over the place, right? So it's a very relevant question. But this is something I have definitely learned to value. Again, it's like, I don't think I appreciated the necessity for building that brand equity as much until the last couple of years. You know, as a a relatively young brand, we are also looking to go out and raise money. And a lot of the feedback when we speak to investors, PE funds, you know, they give that feedback that you need to start building brand equity now, because, you know, for the last 12 years, you know, in this bull market, basically since, you know, the recession, it's been really easy for a lot of brands, I think, because performance marketing has just sort of popped up, and it's people, if you know how to if you know how to do it, then and you're good at it, then you're probably going to have a much higher chance of success during that period. All of a sudden, you have this pandemic which just springs upon brands, and many brands, including ourselves, are hit by that. And, you know, because maybe you've been too reliant on performance marketing, maybe you haven't built enough brand equity, that organic traffic that you would have through building brand equity isn't there to the same extent. And when you layer, for example, higher CPCs, that Facebook are pumping up CPCs, same with Google, you know, all ad platforms, then, you know, all of a sudden you need your conversion rates to multiply by a greater extent than just the CPCs, because you're also having conversion rates fall because consumer sentiment's falling because of because you're in a pandemic and people are less inclined to buy, or at least after sort of the initial 6 months where people just had a lot of cash in their pocket. But when people, you know, after that 6 months, that's when it started flipping, basically. And so for us, it was a big learning curve, and we had actually hired our brand director, now our CBO, just before the pandemic. So we were a lot more performance driven before that, but we've been trying to, you know, we are investing more and more now into our brand activities, but trying to have a balance. But it's really difficult. You know, there's often that, you know, you should read a lot of articles which say sort of that 60-40 rule, that you should be investing 60% of brand. But I think it's very contextual. Like you need to put it into perspective of where your business is at and where your engagement's at. And you can't just pivot from one day to the next. You know, if you've gone from performance to, if you've had a very performance-driven approach, and now you want to start building more longevity to the brand, you can't just turn it around. It doesn't work like that. You'll hit your top line probably pretty significantly if you're allocating the same level of marketing dollar into your pool. So, but it's a really interesting topic, and it's one I don't think anyone really knows the answer to. It's about feeling it, and I think the CMO should, or the performance director or the brand director should know their business well enough to understand what that point is and how to, you know, and you looking at your P&L, being responsive to that, right? And looking at depending on what category you're in, what does retention look like? You know, all these different brand engagement metrics. It's very, very contextual. So I would be very reluctant to blurt out random numbers, which you very commonly see and hear. Because people often like to think that they know it, but I think for us, you know, it's been a very steep learning curve, and we're now trying to build more longevity into our brand, and that means investing, you know, in content, and also creative, and then other campaigns too. You know, for example, we launched the world's most sustainable watch earlier this year, which took 2 years of research, and it's that kind of message where you're at the forefront of kind of a topic that allows you to build that equity. But don't get me wrong as well, you can also do both at the same time. And I think you can also leverage brand very much within performance. I think sometimes that this discussion can get a little bit lost, and people almost revert into this, oh, well, we must invest lots in PR, we must invest on billboards, and, you know, go back to the 80s and the 90s, you know, how we were building brands. That I don't think that needs to be the case. I think you can leverage modern platforms like YouTube, you know, to put out great content, and that is the same as building the brand in those other sort of old school practices, and you get the best of both worlds of building performance metrics into that. And it can convert too as well. You know, if you have good content, and you sort of tailor it towards maybe, for example, your retargeting audience, you can make it work for you. So you can actually have, when you go and communicate to those wider stakeholders and you're saying, okay, yeah, we need to invest in brand. We are investing in brand. We've got great video content for YouTube, and it converts. So it assists kind of both sides. So it's important to for me at least, to weigh them both up with kind of the same frame, and I think they can work together.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge within the industry at the moment, is people want this answer. They want this answer to cling on to. It's like, what do we do when we reach a certain amount of revenue? How much money do we put back into brand building? How much money do we put into activation? And it's a bit like your campaigns and everything that you run. There's things that work for your brand and there's things that will work for another brand. And you've just got to test. You've got to test your budgets. You've got to test your hypothesis and give it long enough to work and say, we stand by this decision, that if we do this for this amount of time, we should see some good results from it. But people want this. Tell me how much money I need to put into brand awareness each month. How much do I put into Facebook ads each month? And it's so unique. And like you said, you've got to be responsible to that P&L. If your P&L is looking not so good, maybe you need to kind of look at which areas can generate the revenue, which areas are sensible to keep spending, and which ones maybe you pull back, make that P&L look a bit better, and then reinvest in.
Exactly. And it's important to categorize what you consider to be branding too. Like even in our discussions in our management meetings, it's a different perspective, because we have a range of different experience of what brand activation is. We also do third-party content advertising, where we'll have a PR article and we'll drive traffic to those articles. That's, for me, that's good branding, because it's digestible content, and it's informative. And for me, the idea of good branding is a consumer leaving with a good interpretation of what the brand is and what their values are, and therefore being able to make a educated purchase decision. That for me is good branding. And there's obviously a variety of different ways you can go about it. But I think the principle is there, at least. I think where it's clear that it's not an excellent branding is if you just push hardcore discounts with no other message, buy today because we've got 50% off. Obviously, the consumers, that's more of an impulse. You're probably not going to have the majority of your customer base leave with the real reason your brand is there today, if it has strong brand values.
There's so many ways that I can go with this. This is super interesting. I think that the discount route is one that's really interesting, because the Hut Group have done discounts incredibly well, but I think they know what they stand for, and they know what they're about, and they know their economics behind their brand. I think where it gets dangerous is where brands chase with discounts, because they want the same results out of performance channels. So that what ends up happening is you actually train your customers to be price sensitive. They wait for those discounts. They don't buy the brand. They just buy. There's no loyalty. It's just the cheapest brand that has the product within the category that they go for. And kind of going into Nordgreen, you're coming out of working with some really smart people, and you're going into a company that started up by some really smart people, ex-McKinsey. What were the kind of initial conversations about how the brand should function and where the brand should go, as the brand's growing? Were they very keen for a data-driven performance model? What were the kind of conversations that you're having? Because these people are super strategic, super analytical. How did you find that?
I think it helped the fact that Vasily was also there, because he was also from the Hut Group. So that obviously was beneficial to the discussion. They also specifically hired us because we came from there, and they see how the Hut Group built brands. So I don't think there was like a need to persuade of the strategy. I would say counter to that, it's in more recent time that we've had to probably persuade the stakeholders of the performance, sort of more of a performance strategy, because of where we are in the world and how consumer sentiment is swinging, and that brand equity topic. Yeah, I think back then, again, 4 or 5 years ago, it was far more leaning towards that performance, but it was very clear also from day one what we wanted to build. And we wanted to build something with meaning, which stood for something, but also offered a quality product for our consumers. So we understood the importance for a modern company. We believe that every company that starts out today should positively contribute to their environment. And so we made that clear internally. That was always like a non-negotiable. And then, so we have 2 brand pillars. One is our sustainable angle, where we give back for every watch that's bought. And then 2 is our design format. And we work with a very successful, renowned designer, Jakob Wagner, who helped design, or who did design, the Bang & Olufsen headphones that you see many people wearing. So we were able to, they were kind of our brand pillars. And so objectively, that's how we saw it. And I think as long as you embed those messages within your performance strategy, you're able to again achieve the best of both worlds. They don't have to live independently, So yeah, that was really the approach. And also, again, with like performance, you used the word test earlier with regards to campaigns. It's so much about testing. And again, no one business. What works for one business doesn't necessarily work for the other, as I quickly realized when I went from the Hut Group to Unilever. So that was, again, another big journey moving from Unilever to also Nordgreen, because, again, it pivoted further. So I think, yeah, that was a learning curve. And it's something that we're still learning today. We're still adapting. We're still better understanding our Facebook and Google and influencer marketing, what's driving the real value, and how they work together. So, but still today we have our 2 brand pillars, and they are ultimately the formidable parts of the brand. And we do develop those, but they have stood as a constant, but you build content and campaigns around those 2 pillars.
And as a brand that's super ambitious about growth, like Nordgreen has been growing pretty rapidly. And I'm guessing that the team behind it are the reason that they're behind the brand is because they want to grow a brand, and they want to grow it, to a pretty substantial size. Like, how have you approached scaling your marketing mix year on year within Nordgreen? Is it identifying channels? How do you approach that?
Yeah, so I think there's two probably elements to it. There's one which focuses probably on new opportunities, there's always new approaches that come out of the e-commerce world, where you hear about this one brand that something's worked for them and you give it a shot, and you're sort of open-minded, whether that be something as generic as, a new social platform like TikTok, or Snapchat, whatever it may be. And then there's other more novel, probably more technical adaptations to a strategy, whether that be, for example, combining content and paid. Yeah, that would probably be one side to it. And then there's, I guess, the scaling of the existing channels. It's the optimizations, and it's the development of those channels, and also what works for you one year doesn't necessarily work for the other for the next. And so it's about constantly testing those new channels. But ultimately, actually, for us, I think still at the heart of e-com, you still basically have 3 main marketing channels, or four sort of platforms. They would be, you have Google, you have Facebook, you have email, and you have influencer, which kind of works across those anyway. Of course, you then have, you have like affiliate, but that's still very much, within the Google network. So I think focusing on those and building out strategies within those different platforms, that is ultimately where, I mean, that's where we still build and put 95% of our resource. And I think you can get easily distracted by all of these shiny new things. But it's important not to spread too thinly. And, you know, if you keep on just taking on more and more tasks and more work streams, you often either have to just hire more people, which becomes which kind of deviates your focus again from what's worked. You just focus less on what has got you to where you are today, really. So it's important to find that balance, really. You want to constantly test and learn, but really make sure that you're focusing on what is working today and what's got you to where you are today. You know, just allocate a proportion of your time to those new opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big dangers at the moment. Like TikTok is, we all read about how amazing growth brands are getting out of TikTok, and it can be, like you said, a distraction. And we were putting together a marketing strategy for a fashion brand, and we were looking at the types of ad creative and organic content brands were putting out on TikTok, and then comparing it to what they're doing on Instagram. And the problem is that they just think it's a copy paste. Oh, I just copy and paste this brand video that's working well on Instagram into TikTok. And it's just almost, you're not really doing it properly. And actually, to go down the route of running TikTok organically or paid, it's actually a commitment, because you need someone who understands the platform, who's going to follow the trends, who's going to create the content around the trends. And that requires a team. You know, that's a real investment. And it's okay to get the social media team to put together a few things and see, okay, how did it go? But to actually say, this is our strategy, you've got to be investing in content every 10 days if you want any form of spend through it. So it's kind of, yeah, I agree with you with this, and it's a danger to get distracted, which it kind of leads me to asking, I'm going to ask the meaty question, which is like, how are you approaching attribution? Everybody that I talk to, it's on their topic list. So are you leveraging different tools? Are you taking a holistic approach to it? Does your team that are very analytical, are they okay with things like blended ROAS, MER, and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge topic, and very subjective, and again, probably requires contextualizing, within each business. But for us, we do look at a blended ROAS. I think that's important, because you need to ultimately look at how your P&L is performing. That should ultimately be your key indicator for most of your strategies, right? And understanding whether it has a short or a long-term impact. We have used attribution tools in the past, where we try to, on a basic level, just understand in particular, what's driving the initial value and how then the other channels sort of mix into that. But again, the sample of data can become very, it can be very, very small. And so really to draw, again, sort of concrete actions can be very difficult for a lot of small brands. That is a very common theme within attribution in general, I've found at least. And so I think what's really important, again, is to test, to see if you pull back on certain elements, how that affects your overall performance. It's also really important to remember that, it's not that black and white. It's like your customer journey can be any one of the many routes. And yes, consumers are quite predictable, but that's not to say that the time at which they shop and the channels, the devices, that they go through is going to be sort of similar to the next. And so it's important to cover a lot of different bases. And while one channel may be, for example, driving the initial interaction, yes, and you obviously need the many follow-up impressions too, across different channels. So it's not as simple as just, investing in channels which are maybe going to drive that first interaction, which is of course a significant part of that attribution topic. And obviously it is very cloudy. There is more technology and a lot more investment going into attribution platforms now, particularly around what the industry is calling fingerprint technology, and looking at a lot of first-party data, and that is enabling us to have a bit of a clearer picture in terms of where the value is really coming. And actually, also with attribution, if you went back again 5 years ago, it was kind of a luxury to have this because the tools were so expensive. And now today, there's a lot more options out there that will allow you to, which will make it a lot more accessible for sort of small and medium-sized companies now. So, and previously, attribution modeling was a lot more around the customer journey, which meant that there were actually there weren't that many players in that. Now it's a lot more about the data accumulation, and it's about being able to follow someone along the different journeys. It's about being able to track them, the different touch points, right? And there's a lot more technology a lot more investment into technology coming out now, particularly in the last 6 to 12 months since, the iOS updates in particular. So for us, we are just keeping our eyes open for this new technology. We are testing actually 2 tools at the moment to better understand as we move into Q4 which one is best suited for us, and whether it really does provide a better understanding of our customer journey. Because I think also one of the most important things around attribution is I think that within the company, you need to just make sure you're all speaking on the same terms and having the same assumptions. The assumptions are almost as valuable as the data that you're looking at, because anyone can formulate a story to support the data that they see. And we're very good at humans to create logic around almost, it's hard to say irrational topics because they're numbers, but you're able to create a picture when there's not really something there. So I think what I do is, for my team, is to just try and create a common argument and a common conversation. So we'll make sure we're all looking at the same things, so that we can lead along those lines. And at least then we have a common strategy of execution. I think otherwise, if you bring on like 10 different tools that you're looking at, everyone's looking at a different thing, and everyone's tossing and turning, pulling in different directions, and you're probably going to end up with quite a profitable company because you're over exposed to too many platforms which aren't really driving value. So I think it's just a mixture of like testing and learning, understand where sort of what's driving those first interactions and how those other channels are really behaving, how they're behaving with one another. And you can do that by pulling and pushing on certain platforms with your ad spend and creatives. And then just trying to build that storyline around your marketing mix so that everyone within the team is kind of speaking a common language.
I think this is the fun thing within marketing. And when we talk about attribution, one of the attribution companies, a lot of them at the moment are judge, jury, and executioner. So they are creating their standpoint on attribution. They're measuring it themselves, leveraging different forms of tracking. And then they're saying, we're better than everybody else because this person had some good results. And it almost creates a narrative that you spin out of it, that of course, like, oh, with our tool, we got better attribution and we did this, or we invested in this channel and we got a lift. But who's to say if you hadn't invested in another channel, you wouldn't have got the same lift, and it was completely against what the attribution tool has said. And it just forms this desire that because you've invested so much into an attribution tool, that you believe that it's instantly the best thing on the market, and that's what you're going to base your decisions on. And if your business is going the right way, okay. But I sometimes think that the challenge that we have is that we change the narrative constantly. So, the attribution tool says that our ROAS on this campaign isn't great, and this one is, this one is great. We put more money in. But what we actually do as marketers is, but this one has a good click-through rate. This is great. And we change the numbers that we're looking at to have the focus, so that by streamlining what is our business's objective and how do we get to that objective. So if it's to grow, I don't know, 50, 100%, year on year, then that's our objective. How we get there with our spend, we assign a budget. And if we actually achieve those goals, we look at, okay, what drove that and how could we maybe optimize it going into the next year? But I think that people are overly obsessing with attribution at the moment when maybe the products aren't quite ready to have that level of obsession. That always leads me to the question that I ask everybody. If you're going to spend time on attribution or content, where would you, if you had half a day or a full day to spend on attribution or content, which one's going to move the needle the most for your business?
Assuming that you have strong assumptions, I would say probably the content.
Yeah, I think so as well. I think you can do a lot more with good content, good messaging, and a good product at the moment. You'll go putting your time and energy into that. If it's a trade up, will probably take you further. I think once you've got product content nailed, then maybe looking for the extra gains that you can get out of attribution could be a really, really good result.
I think it also, just to add to that as well, again, it's really important as well to put it into context as to the business size and how much data you're getting in, right? Because for a lot of small brands, maybe they just don't get enough data through. So that makes it very difficult to steer their decisions. So that it's important to put it in that context that, again, it's kind of a luxury of a larger company that has a lot of data to put more effort on that content side, because they have enough data to make those assumptions to be able to steer their strategy.
Yeah, and that's it. Like a single variable can really shift the strategy, and that's what you see with small brands. Is they have a theory because last week's ROAS was great in a certain campaign structure or a certain interest or audience, and then they scale it. They scale it, and then they're like, oh shit, that didn't work. And then they're like, okay, now we decrease it and we put it into this one, and they're constantly chasing. But what they have to realize is the sample's so small that basic deviation skews the results massively. And it can be the difference between a good week and a bad week. You can be unlucky. People didn't convert. The weather was good. That can happen, but they chase for that logic. And I think that's probably one of the best nuggets out of this is that, you've got to look at sample size. You've got to have your own theories and you've got to execute them for long enough to see the impact of them. Chris, it's been absolutely wonderful having you on the show today. There is so much good stuff in this episode. I think people will have got a lot out of it, both from a technical side, but also a bigger picture thinking. It's been so awesome having you on the show.
Yeah, thank you very much. Hopefully, hopefully it was useful.
Yeah, 100%.